I knew I was raped, and you weren't nothing but a bunch of scum.
Therefore, these proceedings are now
Putting
concluded.
somebody who was raped to death.
In the shadows of human despair, a creature arose. A woman, propelled by a tangled history of trauma, abuse, and violence, created a path of devastation. Her actions stunned the nation, igniting a discourse that lingered for years. The question on everyone's mind was she an authentic monster, motivated by a thirst for violence, or merely a victim of her circumstances, shaped by the flames of trauma and abandonment? We invited people to explore the psyche of a murderer and reveal the reality behind this tragic and chilling narrative. Aileen Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her life was marked by a series of tragic events that had a profound impact on her future. From a young age, Aileen's world was turned upside down by a series of devastating events. The first blow came when Aileen's mother abandoned her and her older brother at the tender age of 4. Their maternal grandparents stepped in to care for them, providing a sense of stability and security that was sadly short-lived. As it transpired, this stability was fleeting, and Aileen's life soon took another dramatic turn. Aileen's father had had a profoundly negative impact on her life. His actions had significantly affected Aileen's mental well-being, setting the stage for a lifetime of struggles. As Aileen navigated her teenage years, she began to exhibit self-destructive behaviors. She started engaging in inappropriate relationships with her peers, often in exchange for basic necessities. This desperate cry for help was a plea for attention and affection in a world that seemed to reject her. Aileen's life continued to spiral downward, marked by exploitation and abuse. The consequences of her actions were devastating, and the world soon came to know her as a woman capable of unspeakable acts. As the years passed, Aileen's life became increasingly turbulent. She found herself trapped in a cycle of violence and abuse with no clear escape. And then, between 1989 and 1990, a drastic change occurred. Aileen Wuornos, the vulnerable and exploited young woman, became involved in a series of tragic events that would change her life forever. Aileen Wuornos' life took a drastic turn over the course of 13 months. During this period, she was involved in the deaths of 7 individuals. According to Aileen, these individuals had either assaulted or attempted to assault her. The nation was shocked and divided by her actions, sparking a heated debate about self-defense and morality. As the trial came to a close, Aileen was convicted of multiple crimes and sentenced to death. As she awaited her fate, the world struggled to understand her actions. Was she a killer or a desperate survivor driven to extremes by a lifetime of hardship and exploitation? The answer was complex, and one that would continue to be debated in the years to come. One thing was certain: Aileen Wuornos' story would have a lasting impact. Her life had been marked by turmoil, and her domestic environment had been unstable. Her grandfather's behavior had been particularly troubling, leaving Aileen battered and bruised. As Aileen navigated her teenage years, she faced another traumatic event. At 14, she became pregnant, and the trauma of that event would haunt her for the rest of her life. On 23 March 1971, she gave birth to a son who was immediately taken away from her and placed for adoption. The film Monster, 2003, chronicled Aileen's life, detailing her experiences and culminating in her sentencing. Charlize Theron's powerful performance as Wuornos earned her the Academy Award for Best Actress, solidifying Aileen's legacy as a woman who had captured the nation's attention. Aileen Wuornos' life had been on a perilous downward spiral. The loss of her child had left her reeling, and the passing of her grandmother, Britta, had created a void that seemed impossible to fill. Her grandfather's behavior had escalated to unbearable levels, forcing 15-year-old Wuornos to flee her home in desperation. With no clear direction, Wuornos found herself in a precarious situation. She had been forced to resort to desperate measures to survive. But this precarious existence was only the beginning of her troubles. In 1974, Wuornos was arrested in Colorado, marking the start of a tangled web of run-ins with the law that would haunt her for years to come. As Wuornos careened from one crisis to the next, her behavior became increasingly erratic. A whirlwind marriage to Louis Gratz-Fell, a 69-year-old yacht club president, ended in annulment after just 9 weeks. The turmoil in her personal life was mirrored by her increasingly explosive outbursts, which often landed her in trouble with the authorities. The summer of 1976 proved to be a pivotal moment in Wuornos's life. The sudden loss of her brother, Keith, left her reeling, and the life insurance payout she received seemed to exacerbate her downward spiral. As Wuornos struggled to cope with the chaos that surrounded her, it seemed clear that her life was hurtling towards a devastating conclusion. But what would be the final straw that sent her tumbling over the edge? Aileen Wuornos's life had been a complex web of turmoil and desperation. As she struggled to find stability, her encounters with law enforcement became increasingly frequent. In 1978, at the age of 22, Wuornos had attempted to take her own life, a desperate cry for help that had been repeated 5 more times before she turned 23. But Wuornos's troubles had only intensified. On 20 May 1981, she had been arrested for armed robbery, a crime that had landed her in prison. Though she had been released on June 30th, 1983, her freedom had been short-lived. Just 9 months later, Wuornos had been incarcerated again, this time for attempting to pass counterfeit checks. As the years passed, Wuornos's life had become a dizzying cycle of crime and punishment. In 1985, she had been identified as a suspect in the theft of a revolver and ammunition. And in January 1986, Wuornos had been arrested in Miami for stealing a car, resisting arrest, and obstructing justice. The police had found a .38 caliber revolver and a box of ammunition in the stolen vehicle, a discovery that had proved to be a turning point in Wuornos's life. But despite the mounting evidence against her, Wuornos's life had been about to take a dramatic turn. In 1986, she had met Tyria Moore, a 24-year-old motel maid who had become her partner. For the first time in her life, Wuornos had felt a sense of stability and belonging. But as she struggled to rebuild her life, the darkness of her past had continued to lurk, waiting to strike. The tension had been palpable, and it had seemed only a matter of time before Wuornos's fragile world came crashing down. And then, on the 4th of July, 1987, the inevitable had happened. Wuornos and Moore had been questioned by the Daytona Beach police about an incident involving allegations of assault and battery. The incident had been a warning sign, a hint that the chaos that had haunted Wuornos for so long was still simmering just below the surface. As the months ticked by, Aileen Wuornos's life began to fray at the edges. The fragile threads that had held her world together were slowly unraveling, threatening to plunge her into chaos. It was as if the very foundations of her existence had been beginning to crumble, leaving her teetering on the brink of disaster. The winter of 1989 had loomed on the horizon, casting a dark and foreboding shadow over Wuornos's life. It had been a time of reckoning, a moment when the accumulated pressures of her past had finally come to a head. The air had been thick with tension, heavy with the promise of impending doom. As the temperatures had dropped and the nights had grown longer, Wuornos had found herself standing at the precipice, staring into an abyss of uncertainty. The silence had been oppressive, punctuated only by the distant hum of a city in slumber. It had been as if the world itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable to occur. And then, in the silence of a cold winter's night, a spark had been lit. A chain reaction of events had been set in motion, one that would leave a trail of devastation in its wake. The consequences of Wuornos' actions had been severe, and the world had soon been left to pick up the pieces. Before we dive into the more details of these heinous crimes, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. A sense of unease had settled over the state of Florida as a string of mysterious murders unfolded. At the center of the chaos had been Aileen Wuornos, a complex and troubled figure with a penchant for violence. The first to fall victim to Wuornos' wrath had been Richard Charles Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner from Clearwater. His body had been discovered on the 1st of December, 1989, with multiple gunshot wounds.
Remember, let them know that I know that the cops knew who I was. After Richard Mallory died, I left prints everywhere, and they covered it up. And let me kill the rest of those guys to turn me into a serial killer. I know they did.
The police had been baffled, but Wuornos' deadly rampage had only just begun. As the months passed, the bodies had piled up. David Andrew Spears, a 47-year-old construction worker from Winter Garden, had been reported missing on 19 May 1990. His naked body had been found 2 weeks later along US 19 in Citrus County with 6 gunshot wounds. The police had been closing in, but Wuornos had remained elusive. Charles Edmund Cascadden, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker, had been found dead on June 6, 1990, in Pasco County. The police had found 9 gunshot wounds on his body, and witnesses had reported seeing Wuornos driving his car. As the summer of 1990 had worn on, the tension had mounted. Peter Abraham Seams, a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman, had gone missing in June 1990. His car had been found abandoned in Orange Springs, Florida, with Wuornos' handprint on the interior door handle. The police had been hot on Wuornos' trail, but she had remained one step ahead. Troy Eugene Burris, a 50-year-old sausage salesman from Ocala, Florida, had been found dead on August 4, 1990, in a wooded area along State Road 19 in Marion County. The autopsy had revealed 2 gunshot wounds. As the body count had risen, the people of Florida had held their breath, wondering when Wuornos would strike again. The atmosphere had been tense, with a sense of impending doom hanging over the state. Aileen Wuornos' killing spree had continued unabated, with the police racing against time to catch her before she struck again. But despite their best efforts, Wuornos had remained at large, always staying one step ahead of her pursuers. Her next victim had been Charles Richard Humphreys, a 56-year-old retired Air Force major. His body had been found on December 12, 1990, in Marion County, bearing the grim hallmark of Wuornos' brutal attacks. The police had been closing in on Wuornos, but she had remained elusive. The final victim had been Walter Gino Antonio, a 61-year-old truck driver. His body had been found on November 19, 1990, along a secluded logging road in Dixie County. As the investigation had gathered momentum, the police had finally got their big break. On 4 July 1990, Wuornos and her partner, Tyria Moore, had abandoned a vehicle after a dramatic incident. A witness had come forward, providing the police with a crucial description of the 2 women. The net had been closing in around Wuornos. The police had discovered some of the victims' belongings in local pawn shops, and a receipt bearing Wuornos' fingerprint had been found at one of these establishments. The evidence had been mounting, and Wuornos' fate had been all but sealed. On the 9th of January 1991, the police finally caught up with Wuornos. She had been arrested at a biker bar in Volusia County, her eyes narrowing as the handcuffs had snapped around her wrists. The game had been over, and Wuornos had known she was running out of time. As the police had closed in, the tension had mounted. Tyria Moore, Wuornos' partner, had been located in Pittston, Pennsylvania, and she had agreed to cooperate with the authorities. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, Moore had consented to help elicit a confession from Wuornos. The stage had been set for a dramatic showdown. Moore had returned to Florida and had initiated a series of phone calls to Wuornos, urging her to confess. With each passing moment, the pressure on Wuornos had intensified. As the hours had ticked by, Wuornos' resolve had begun to crumble. The police had been closing in, and she had known it. The weight of her secrets had been becoming too much to bear. And then, in a shocking turn of events, Wuornos had finally cracked. On 16th January 1991, she had admitted to the murders, claiming that the men had attempted to assault her and she had acted in self-defense. The confession had been a stunning revelation, one that had changed the course of the investigation forever. Trial. As the days had ticked by, Aileen Wuornos' fate had drawn ever closer. In a surprising turn of events, she had been legally adopted by Arlene Prowler in November 1991. But despite this unexpected development, Wuornos' destiny had remained unchanged. The trial for the murder of Richard Charles Mallory had been fast approaching, and the tension had been palpable. The prosecution had built a strong case against Wuornos, and under Florida's Williams rule, they had been able to introduce evidence of her previous crimes. This revelation had sent shockwaves through the courtroom, as the true extent of Wuornos' actions had become clear. The jury had listened with rapt attention, their faces growing increasingly somber as the evidence had mounted. And then, on 27th January 1992, the verdict had been delivered. Wuornos had been found guilty of Mallory's murder. The sentencing hearing had been a dramatic affair, with psychiatrists testifying that Wuornos had had borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. The courtroom had been on edge, sensing that the final act was about to unfold. And then, on 31st January 1992, the sentence had been passed. Wuornos had been condemned to death. The courtroom had erupted into a flurry of activity as the reality of Wuornos' situation had sunk in. As Aileen Wuornos had stood before the court, a sense of anticipation had filled the air. Her eyes had seemed to hold a deep intensity, as if guarding secrets that only she had known. Over the next few months, Wuornos entered no contest pleas for the murders of Charles Richard Humphreys, Troy Eugene Burress, and David Andrew Spears. The courtroom had been electrified with tension as Wuornos' testimony had begun to unravel. Initially, she had claimed that all 7 men had either raped or attempted to rape her. But as the trial had progressed, Wuornos' story had begun to shift. She had later retracted her claim of self-defense, revealing a more complex motive. Wuornos had admitted that she had killed the men for one reason: robbery. As the verdicts had begun to roll in, the sense of inevitability had grown. In May 1992, Wuornos had been sentenced to death 3 more times. The following month, she had pleaded guilty to the murder of Charles Edmund Cascadden, earning her 5th death sentence in November 1992. And in February 1993, Wuornos had pleaded guilty to the murder of Walter Geno Antonio, resulting in yet another death sentence. The outcome had been all but certain. Wuornos' fate had been sealed, and the only question remaining had been when her sentence would be carried out. The courtroom had been heavy with anticipation, sensing that the final act was about to unfold. As the days had ticked by, Aileen Wuornos' fate had drawn ever closer. The truth about her crimes had finally begun to surface, leaving the courtroom in a state of stunned silence. But just as it had seemed that the truth was finally out, Wuornos had dropped a bombshell. In a shocking admission, she had claimed that her genuine motive had been self-defense. However, this revelation had come with a significant caveat. After spending 10 long years on death row, Wuornos had grown tired of her existence. She had wanted to expedite her own death, and her admission had been the first step towards making that a reality. As Wuornos had sat on death row, her behavior had become increasingly erratic. She had been transferred from the Broward Correctional Institution to the Florida State Prison, where her fate had been ultimately sealed. The countdown to her execution had begun, and the world had waited with bated breath for the final chapter in the saga of Aileen Wuornos. The tension had mounted as Wuornos's appeals had been rejected one by one. In 1996, her appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court had been denied, marking a devastating blow to her chances of overturning her conviction. Wuornos's time had been running out, and the world had known it. The question on everyone's mind had been, what would happen next? As the years had gone by, Aileen Wuornos' behavior had become increasingly unsettling. She had made accusations against the prison staff, claiming they had been tampering with her food. The allegations had been disturbing, and it had seemed as though Wuornos had been becoming increasingly paranoid. The tension had mounted in 2001 when Wuornos had made a shocking announcement. In a petition to the Florida Supreme Court, she had requested to dismiss her legal counsel and withdraw all ongoing appeals. The decision had sent shockwaves through the legal community, leaving many to wonder what had driven Wuornos to make such a drastic move. As the days had turned into weeks, Wuornos's actions had become increasingly unpredictable. In a series of candid interviews with documentary Nick Broomfield, Wuornos had offered a glimpse into her troubled mind. Her words had been laced with a sense of calmness, but beneath the surface, a sense of desperation had seemed to simmer. The anticipation had been palpable. What would happen next? Would Wuornos's fate have been sealed, or would she have found a way to escape the inevitable? The world had watched with bated breath, waiting for the next chapter in the saga of Aileen Wuornos. As the final days had ticked by, Aileen Wuornos's emotions had been in turmoil. One moment she had seemed calm and serene. The next, her mood had shifted, and she had unleashed a torrent of anger and frustration. The anticipation had been building, and it had seemed as though Wuornos had been counting down the days until her execution. Her words had been laced with a sense of desperation, and it had been clear that she had been determined to make her voice heard. As the hours had ticked by, the sense of inevitability had grown. Wuornos' fate had been all but sealed, and the world had waited with bated breath for the final chapter in her saga. Finally, on the 9th of October 2002, the day of reckoning had arrived. Aileen Wuornos had been led to the execution chamber, her eyes scanning the room with a sense of calm determination. As the lethal injection had been administered, Wuornos's eyes had seemed to hold 1,000 secrets, and the world had been left to ponder the true nature of this complex and troubled woman. As the moment of truth had approached, Aileen Wuornos's final words had hung in the air like a challenge. Her eyes had seemed to bore into the souls of those present, as if daring them to understand the complexity of her existence. The execution had marked a pivotal moment in American history, one that had sparked heated debates and controversy surrounding capital punishment. Wuornos had become a symbol of the system's flaws, a testament to the brutal consequences of a life gone wrong. As the news of her execution had spread, a sense of unease had settled over the nation. People had struggled to come to terms with the fact that a woman, once full of life and promise, had met such a tragic end. In the aftermath, Wuornos's ashes had been scattered beneath a tree in Michigan, a poignant reminder of the transience of life. Her funeral had been a celebration of her existence, a tribute to the turbulent life she had lived. The haunting melody of Natalie Merchant's Carnival had seemed to capture the essence of Wuornos's story, a poignant reminder of the fragility of the human spirit. As the experts had delved deeper into Aileen Wuornos's psyche, a chilling picture had begun to emerge. Her crimes, once seen as heinous and inexplicable, had been attributed to a complex interplay of psychological trauma and psychopathic tendencies. The anticipation had been palpable as the investigation into Wuornos's past had continued. What secrets had been uncovered? What traumas had driven her to commit such horrific crimes? The questions had lingered, leaving many to ponder the true nature of this complex and troubled woman. As the truth had begun to surface, it had become clear that Wuornos's upbringing had been marred by sexual abuse and neglect. Her involvement in sex work had only intensified her emotional wounds, leaving her with lasting psychological scars. The lack of a supportive maternal figure had also taken a devastating toll on her mental health. The pieces of the puzzle had slowly fallen into place, revealing a complex and troubled individual. But as the experts had drawn closer to the truth, they had been unable to shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of Wuornos's psyche. What other secrets had lain hidden beneath the surface? As the truth about Aileen Wuornos's life had begun to unravel, a disturbing picture had emerged. Her childhood, marred by trauma and abuse, had set the stage for a tragic descent into darkness. The details of her past, though shocking, had been a testament to the devastating consequences of neglect and abuse. As the story had unfolded, it had become clear that Wuornos's life had been a tangled web of trauma, with each thread intricately connected to the next. The anticipation had been palpable as the details of Wuornos's past had come to light. What secrets had driven her to commit such horrific crimes? The answers, though shocking, had not been entirely unexpected. As the investigation into Wuornos's life had continued, it had become clear that her actions had been a desperate cry for help. Her crimes, though heinous, had been a symptom of a deeper issue, an issue that had been festering for years. Wuornos's story had been a complex tapestry of trauma, abuse, and neglect. Her struggles with borderline personality disorder, a direct result of her traumatic childhood, had left her with a fragile grip on reality. As the narrative of her life had unfolded, it had become clear that Wuornos had been living in a state of constant turmoil. Her emotions, raw and unbridled, had dictated her actions that had ultimately led to her downfall. As the narrative of Wuornos's life had unfolded, the tension had built. What had happened next? How had her story ultimately unfolded? The answers, though heartbreaking, had provided a profound insight into the human psyche. As the final chapters of Wuornos's life had come to a close, it had been clear that her story would leave a lasting impact. Her legacy, though complex and multifaceted, had served as a reminder of the devastating consequences of trauma and abuse. As the investigation into Aileen Wuornos's life had continued, a sense of unease had settled over those who had been following her story. FBI profiler Robert Ressler's observations of Wuornos's behavior had only added to the growing tension. What had driven her to commit such heinous crimes? The answer, much like Wuornos herself, had remained shrouded in mystery. As the truth had begun to emerge, a troubling image had taken shape. Wuornos's childhood, marred by trauma and abuse, had set the stage for a tragic descent into darkness. Her actions, though indefensible, had served as a reminder of the profound effects of trauma on the human mind. The suspense had been palpable, and the sense of foreboding had been overwhelming. Wuornos's existence had been a complex interplay of trauma, abuse, and behavioral issues. Her struggles with mental health, coupled with her traumatic upbringing, had created a perfect storm of chaos and destruction. As the final chapters of Wuornos's life had come to a close, the question had lingered. What had driven a person to commit such horrific crimes? The answer, though elusive, had continued to haunt those who had sought to understand the complexities of the human psyche. The anticipation had been building, and the sense of unease had been growing. What had happened next? How had Wuornos' story ultimately unfolded? The answers, though heartbreaking, had provided a profound insight into the human condition. As the truth about Wuornos' life had continued to emerge, one thing had been clear. Her story had left a lasting impact on all who had heard it. Conclusion. The shadows had been unveiled, exposing a truth that was both unsettling and fearsome. A life had been shaped by trauma and abandonment, and a psyche had been distorted by the merciless grip of destiny. The offenses committed were atrocious, yet the narrative was a multifaceted weave of anguish, torment, and hopelessness. In contemplating this sorrowful account, we were compelled to face the darkness that had resided within each of us. The lingering question was, what had compelled an individual to perpetrate such heinous acts? The answer, akin to the perpetrator herself, had remained enveloped in enigma. Thank you for watching. If you found this video thought-provoking, please consider subscribing for more content. Share with your friends and family to spark meaningful conversations. Your support means the world.